we should challenge it, because innovation is not the most important thing in a society. It's important, don't get me wrong. I think it's very important, but not at all costs.
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. My guest today, Marietje Schaake, is the author of the brilliant new book, The Tech Coup: How to Save Democracy from Silicon Valley. The book explains how the tech industry has essentially captured government, including how it serves many of the functions of governments, but without the oversight embedded in democracies. This includes in the national security realm, certain domestic functions, and in the maintenance of democracy itself. Marietje Schaake is an old friend of mine and former member of the European Parliament from the Netherlands. We kick off our conversation discussing an experience that she had while leading the EU's election observation mission in Kenya in 2017, when a faulty French voting tech company upended the election with fraught political consequences. We then discuss the tech industry's role in supplanting government in the national security realm, and why Elon Musk's alliance with Donald Trump is so potentially dangerous for democracy. The Tech Coup is one of the best books I've read this year. It is getting rave reviews. I will post a link to it in the show notes of this episode. The book presents, in my view, a very compelling argument for why democracies should push back against the growing influence of the tech industry and how they may do so. So one quick note before we start. I know a number of you listeners of Global Dispatches are also, like me, proud UN nerds. You should subscribe to globaldispatches.org, where you can unlock full access to my still new show about the UN, To Save Us from Hell. We took the name from Dag Hammarskjöld's famous quote that the United Nations was not created to deliver us to heaven, but to save us from hell. Each week, co-host Anjali Dayal and I discuss latest events and happenings around the United Nations. It is a show by UN nerds for UN nerds and anyone interested in how that puzzle palace works. Our most recent episode is about Israel's ongoing attacks against UN peacekeepers in Lebanon and what that means for peacekeeping more broadly and for the escalation of conflict in the Middle East today. Most of those episodes are behind a paywall, so you'll have to purchase a subscription on globaldispatches.org, and then you're able to listen to Save Us from Hell on any podcast listening platform. Now, here is my conversation with Marietje Schaake, who is a non-resident fellow at Stanford's Cyber Policy Center and at the Institute for Human-Centered AI, and of course, author of The Tech Coup: How to Save Democracy from Silicon Valley. Marietje, I wanted to kick off by talking to you a little bit about the Kenya 2017 elections. I know the book was inspired, at least in part, by your experience as a member of the European Parliament leading the European Union's election observer mission for those elections. Can you just explain what happened and why that incident and that experience served as an inspiration for this book?
Yes, so the Tech Coup is written about the outsized power of tech companies and how that hurts democracy. And this is a phenomenon that I've observed over the past, 15 to 20 years, 10 of which I served as a member of the European Parliament. And what happened in Kenya, and I'm so glad you bring it up as the first question, because it is so striking. And yet, because it happened halfway around the world, too few people in the US, certainly in the West more broadly, even noticed what happened. So Kenya has a history of very, very bad election related violence.
Particularly in the election preceding the one you observed, the 2007 elections were horribly violent.
Yes, they were awful and they led to ICC cases that were later dropped. I mean, the worst kind of violence: murder, rape, massive displacement. I mean, it was awful. And so tensions around elections tend to be significant in Kenya. And at the same time, a lot of work has been done to overcome those very dark pages in the country's history. And so, with a new constitution and with high hopes again that, maybe these elections would be more fair, people had placed a lot of anticipation and hope in the digitization of the electoral process, because there's also allegations and a history of fraud through what they call ballot stuffing. And so the hope was that by digitizing the elections, it would simply be impossible to cheat. So when I was appointed as the chief observer, I didn't know that the tech component would be so strong. But ultimately, what happened was that the opposition alleged that during the presidential election, there had been tampering with the servers of the official election committee. And so the path to seek justice was through going to the Supreme Court. So, ultimately, the opposition reluctantly actually brought the case before the Supreme Court. And the court, in seeking to assess the veracity of this claim, wanted to have access to the country's servers to see, or have experts look at, whether those were tampered with, what was the normal proceeding, what was a deviation thereof, et cetera, et cetera. And the company that had provided all the election technology, with which indeed there had been a lot of problems, was a French company which was unable or unwilling, I guess we'll never know, to give that access to the Supreme Court for assessing the claims by the opposition. And because the Supreme Court was unable to verify what had happened, it saw no other choice but to do a do over of the presidential election, because it said, since we were not in a position to assess the claims that were brought before us, we cannot dismiss them or we cannot agree with them, so we'll have to do the election over.
I mean, that's just like wild to emphasize for a
It's
moment
wild.
that an entire election in a very fraught political environment was annulled for the fact that the Supreme Court of Kenya just couldn't basically get anyone from this French company on the phone to help them assess the veracity of claims of server tampering.
It took long, and there was no possibility, apparently, to indeed, I think within a couple of weeks, to get that assessment done. And so it is wild. It's also wild to just, note that the election, because it was done digitally through this company, cost an average of 25 US dollars per Kenyan person. And in the Netherlands, which is, many more times the GDP, but we still vote on paper with red pencils, it costs about 4 US dollars per person. So the cost involved and the gap between the anticipation of this leading to more trust and overcoming some of those past tensions was completely shattered. That hope was shattered.
What does this experience tell you about the role of tech companies in the maintenance of democracy itself?
Well, when it comes to the example of elections, I think it's just very clear, very stark that this company did not play a constructive role. And around elections, we see other examples, such as, the impact of disinformation. In Kenya, there were painful lessons learned as well about Cambridge Analytica and what it was trying to do. And so, what it teaches us is that this is one example of where tech companies have taken on an enormous role in deciding how a democratic process runs. But it's one example in a long list. And what I'm sad about is that there was not more curiosity and interest from lawmakers in the United States in particular, but really politicians around the world, to learn how examples of the harms of unaccountable tech were very clear around the world. Think about, the calls for genocide in Myanmar, cases of disinformation in many parts of the world that were very harmful, not only about politics, but also about healthcare, for example. And it just seems that only when this problem hit home, with the storming of the US Capitol, January 6th, with the foreign interference through social media platforms. And only when these problems really started to impact Americans was there more debate in the US about what these US companies should do differently. And so it's just one more example in how market forces have been given too much space for too long, and how the hope that the wave of new technologies, the internet, social media, mobile phones, how those new technologies would bring a democratization about as well. And, we have to realize that they haven't, not in places like Kenya and not in the United States either.
So there are other realms in which governments have become over dependent on technology companies, one of which is the national security domain. What are some examples of tech companies assuming the role of government in national security?
So you're right. It's a great place to jump to because, in most rule of law based societies, the use of force is still very squarely the monopoly of the state and its institutions. And in many countries, too, there's a need for a very articulate mandate when the country engages in war. There are clear paths of accountability. And it's really seen as one of the sort of heaviest political decisions to be made. That is for kinetic warfare, or war when it's about tanks. In the digital domain, in the cyber domain, the whole legal framework around what amounts to a violation of a country's sovereignty, when the UN Charter is violated, when the Geneva Conventions are upheld or violated, are completely blurred. It is a gray zone from an international law point of view, and yet we see companies taking more and more significant decisions. For example, to use offensive attacks to defend networks. So we have private companies taking out, let's say, hacker networks of all kinds, criminal, state led, what have you, across borders, but without a very clear mandate, without transparency. We often don't even know what kind of activities have taken place to scan networks for risk, to defend them, because the communication and the information about what exactly happens is also in the hands of private companies. So we just see more and more blindsiding of democratic leaders and institutions and publics in democratic societies, while companies gain more and more understanding of our digital lives and are becoming operatives. A very telling example is also Elon Musk and his making available of Starlink satellite internet connections above
I was just
range.
about to ask you about that because it is something that you treat in your book as well. And I think it's just a really fascinating example of the outsourcing of something that's such like a core national security priority of the United States right now to the whims of a individual who is, fairly capricious in his decision making.
I agree. And I'm actually surprised that there are not more people in national security circles who are just thinking, wait a minute, we thought bringing on board all these companies was going to make us more efficient or more up to speed with technological developments, but really we're becoming dependent and we are no longer in full control vis-a-vis people like Elon Musk, where he owns critical infrastructure, has a very articulate geopolitical agenda, political agenda as well, and those are not always aligned with that of the
Mhm.
government of the United States or that of NATO or that of the democratic coalitions around the world. So it's a very worrying kind of dependence that is actually not so much about whether you like Elon Musk or not, but it just says a lot about leaving so much decision making power into the hands of CEOs rather than prime ministers, parliaments, and so on.
Yeah, and just to be clear, and we're both referring to the fact that Elon Musk made Starlink available to Ukraine, ostensibly in support of Ukraine's defense. But then, when it started, say, costing him too much, he went to the United States government and had them pick up the bill. Now, reading that section of your book, I sort of now understand it to be that Elon Musk made it available for free in order to kind of capture the Defense Department and make the Defense Department dependent on him for that kind of critical piece of infrastructure. And of course, he's also limited the use of Starlink for Ukrainian defense in certain circumstances as well.
Right. He has ideas about when it is and is not a legitimate situation to deploy Starlink. And his reading of those circumstances, for example, being more critical of the situation in Crimea, are not at all aligned with the U.S. government. Yet he's making U.S. government, quite dependent on him, and we see his erratic behavior in more places around the world. Now, recently, in a confrontation with a justice in Brazil, which happened after I wrote the Tech Coup, but still is one of these examples where we see Musk again acting as if laws may exist in other democracies, but just don't apply to him, not to X, formerly Twitter, not to Starlink. And he's also willing to leverage these companies to support each other. So when a Brazilian judge ruled that access to the platform should be banned in the country, Elon Musk said, oh no, well, we'll just circumvent the legal ban by deploying Starlink. So he's really increasingly bold in rolling out his own geopolitical agenda with his own companies, capital, technologies, and now in full alliance with Donald Trump.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that actually very specifically. And I do want to know that your book is like not about Elon Musk. And in fact,
No,
you emphasize throughout your book that, in fact, very small tech companies also play a very outsized role in this phenomenon that you describe of tech company capture of governments. But while we're on the subject of Elon Musk, I do just want to get your interpretation of this very open alliance now between Donald Trump and Elon Musk. Like, should Trump win election here, 3 weeks from now, how do you foresee that enabling some of the trends you identify and define in your book, particularly as it relates to, say, Elon Musk?
well, it will really torpedo Musk and a number of his peers, Peter Thiel, some of the VCs like Mark Andreessen, who've also put their weight and capital behind Donald Trump in a clear driver's seat. And we've already seen contours of what that means. So I was actually quite surprised, even if I thought I'd seen it all, that JD Vance said that if the EU dares to regulate Elon Musk's platforms, that he will be happy to make the US pull out of NATO. So they're really leveraging geopolitical stakes of the highest kind to basically blackmail the EU to back off in any regulatory
Mhm.
efforts that would impact Elon Musk. So this is really,
Yeah.
unprecedented, where I said JD Vance doubles as a lobbyist for X, for Twitter. It's really wild. I haven't seen anything like this before. Trump is unique and unprecedented in many ways, in a worrying way, if you ask me. But then having this synergy or this unholy alliance between these very wealthy tech magnates and Trump and Vance, I mean, it won't serve democracy. And that's the core of the Tech Coup, the book that I wrote. I want to see more resilience in rule of law based democratic societies. And I think we've underappreciated how the power grab by tech companies have contributed to the erosion of democracy.
So you also identify in your book ways in which democracies can fight back, ways in which this kind of eating away of democracies by tech companies can be halted and even reversed. So what can be done to reverse this tech coup as you describe it?
Well, there's a lot that can be done, and I'm sure people will think about regulation, and there's a lot that's needed there, particularly in the United States, to have guardrails, to have data protection laws, etc. But what I do in the Tech Coup is look much more directly at how to break the grip on governance that tech companies have. So I look at regulations, but also at investments and the purchasing power of governments, because for a lot of tech companies, governments are actually their biggest clients, and that leverage is underutilized by governments to say, look, we are going to demand more reflection of public values in the services that you provide. They should be more transparent. They should be governed with an eye for the community. We don't want to see lock ins, contracts that you can't get out of. We want to have obligations with regard to updating your software so that hospitals or other public institutions do not become vulnerable for cyber attacks just because they cannot afford the latest software suites. So, using procurements, to be precise, I think is an opportunity. Investing much more in public digital infrastructure is another. But, and I think this is really important to note, my criticism is not just on tech companies, big or small. I'm also very critical of the fact that generations of Democratic leaders, Democrats, Republicans, progressives, conservatives, have really abdicated their responsibility and allowed this power grab to happen. And perversely, there are many instances where democratic governments are actually all too eager to use technology to what they believe is their own benefit, but which is really going into that very gray legal zone with regard to the rule of law. So, for example, the use of spyware by police services and having no transparency or accountability about it, or the engaging in cyber attacks across borders without clarity on, whose mandate, what accountability is something that states also all too eagerly engage in.
Mhm.
So I'm also suggesting there should be something that I call a public accountability extension, which means that when governments are using tech that they get from tech companies to perform government services, whether it's running the tax authority or going after criminals or just going about their operations, that there should be the same kind of accountability. Think of a FOIA, a Freedom of Information request in the US context, that those tech companies should be as transparent and as accountable as the government would be,
Mhm.
because the government is using taxpayer money and engaging these companies to act in their name, yet the level of accountability is completely different. So these are just a couple of examples. I could name more where I think there are examples that we can
Mhm.
really start with today to rebalance the relationship between democratic governments and tech companies.
When it comes to artificial intelligence in particular, such like a fast developing tech right now that presumably will have or already does have in ways I'm sure you can articulate really big implications for democracy, for governance more broadly. Is there anything like unique about AI that demands different ways of thinking about governance and oversight?
Yes and no. So I think in many ways AI is treated as being entirely different and so unique, while in many ways it's just the latest wave of an emerging technology where companies that already had significant amounts of data, significant amounts of capital, were in a perfect starting position to actually also then stake out their role in developing AI products. So in many ways, the fact that there's a handful of key AI companies is also supported by the lack of regulation earlier on, which has allowed them to scrape the entire internet, build all these new models with data that was produced by others. What makes AI unique from a regulatory perspective and an oversight perspective is that it's highly individualized. So, what you experience is different from what I experience, is different from what you will experience in a week, is different from what I saw 5 days ago. And so, just from a plain oversight point of view, how do we have oversight over something that is so different for everyone and
Hmm.
that is constantly changing? And thirdly, that is so intransparent because tech companies are shielding their algorithms, their AI models with trade secrecy protections oftentimes. And so it's very hard to know why certain outcomes, even if they discriminate or if they lead to danger to, public safety or public health, it's hard to know why the outcomes were generated by generative AI, for example. And so, from an oversight point of view, it is incredibly difficult to apply that. And so, there have to be new ways sought to make sure that companies comply with the spirit of the law, with the core principles that exist in our societies. And to name another thing that really surprises me, AI discriminates and discrimination is illegal, yet it happens and there are so few consequences. So, to some extent, we should just begin to start treating everything that happens in the digital domain the same way we would treat events in the rest of the world that we live
Mhm.
in, to just make sure that we have safety mechanisms, that we have independent oversight, that we don't put on experimental services, and the way we don't throw out experimental medicine in society. We say if you want to try something new, it can only be done in a clinical trial, with very strong guardrails. We need to be much more careful with the way in which we experiment with our society when it comes to AI.
And you have this great line in your book, and I'm doing this from memory. It's not in front of me, so you'll have to correct me, Marietje. But essentially, you take on this notion that regulation stifles innovation by saying, well, if our morals, if what the values that drive our society are democracy, then maybe yes, we do need some guardrails. We do need to stifle innovation in order to ensure that these innovations happen in a way that's compatible with democratic values.
Yeah, so in the Tech Coup, I spent some time looking at how lobbying works, how framing of debates work, so that the reader understands why we've come to hear a sentence like regulation stifles innovation so often that we don't even challenge it anymore. And I think we've come to a point where it's fair to challenge it. So the phrase regulation stifles innovation is probably the favorite lobbying phrase of tech companies. Once you've thought about it, you'll see it everywhere. And it really works. Lawmakers, I've seen this with my own eyes, are scared to stifle innovation, and they don't want to be the old fashioned people that are not reaping the opportunities of new technologies and so on. So it's a very effective lobbying phrase. But at the same time, we should challenge it because innovation is not the most important thing in a society. It's important, don't get me wrong. I think it's very important, but not at all costs. And so I think we have to accept the fact that, yes, sometimes it's perfectly fine to stifle innovation, if that's what you want to call it, because we actually want to protect our democratic process. And we need to make sure that discrimination doesn't happen or that hatred online doesn't lead to violence in the streets. There are always trade offs to be made, and innovation is one objective. Protecting fundamental rights is another very important one. Protecting national security is another. And so innovation just doesn't go above everything else, is what I write in the Tech Coup, and I fundamentally believe that.
Well, Marietje, we'll have to leave there. Again, congratulations on this book. It's really, really good. It really kind of changed my outlook and mindset, and I could not more strongly recommend it to listeners.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.